2 years of therapy, specialists, and money couldn't get my daughter to speak. Tonight, a man I'd never met did it in minutes, and I have no idea how. The grand ballroom of the Hilton downtown pulsed with the energy of money, influence, and carefully polished charm. Crystal chandeliers spilled golden light over a sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. Waiters in white gloves wove between clusters of guests, balancing silver trays heavy with champagne flutes. The air carried the mingled scent of expensive perfume, roasted salmon, and fresh-cut lilies arranged in towering centerpieces on every table. At the far end of the room, a raised stage stood ready for speeches, a large banner for the Lane Tech annual gala draped behind it. Cameras from local news crews and business journals roamed like predators, pausing on the faces of those who mattered. And among all the people in the spotlight, one man drew more attention than anyone else: Gregory Lane. The billionaire CEO was exactly what the magazines promised: tall, impeccably dressed in a midnight blue suit that looked tailored down to the stitch, salt and pepper hair perfectly combed, his handshake firm, his smile photogenic. Conversations paused when he passed. People leaned in when he spoke. Yet while his body moved through the crowd, shaking hands, offering polite nods, his mind was fixed on a single point across the room. Ava, his daughter, sat in a chair near the wall, just beyond the sweep of the ballroom spotlight, her presence quiet yet luminous in its own way. At 7 years old, she had a delicate frame, her dark curls soft against her pale skin. The slender white cane leaned against her leg, the rubber tip resting on the polished floor. Beside her, the warm body of her golden retriever guide dog pressed close, breathing in slow, steady rhythm. Since the day her mother died, Ava hadn't spoken a word. Not one. The funeral had been 2 years ago, but Gregory could still remember the way she clung to him at the graveside, trembling, her lips pressed shut as though sealing something inside. Doctors had named it selective mutism, explaining it as trauma's stubborn grip. Therapists had tried everything: games, music, gentle coaxing, but nothing had broken the silence. To the world, Gregory Lane was a man who could command boardrooms, negotiate billion-dollar deals, and reshape entire industries. But here, standing only yards from his daughter, he felt powerless. You can build empires, he thought bitterly, but you can't give her back her voice. From his place in the crowd, he studied her as if trying to decipher a code. Her small hand moved in slow circles over the soft fur at the dog's neck, her fingers occasionally tracing the handle of her cane. Every so often, her head tilted slightly, toward the music, toward the echo of laughter, but she never turned toward the people. Her world was sound and touch, and she held it close like a fortress. A group of investors cornered him, eager to discuss a potential expansion in Europe, their words a blur in his ears. He nodded at the right moments, signed the cocktail napkin one of them shoved toward him, but all the while his eyes drifted back to her. He wondered if she knew how many people in the room loved her, or if all she felt was the space between her and everyone else. Gregory's chest tightened. The gala was meant to celebrate success, but all he could feel was failure. The heavy double doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open, letting in a draft of cool night air from the street. Conversations rippled but quickly returned to their steady hum. This was the Lane Tech Gala. After all, new arrivals usually meant another partner, another politician, or another figure worth shaking hands with. But the man who stepped inside didn't belong to this world. Daniel entered without the polish or the posture of the other guests. His flannel shirt was clean but worn soft at the elbows, the red fading in spots from years of wash. His jeans were the sturdy kind meant for work, not style, and the brown leather boots on his feet bore the scuffs of long days on garage floors. His shoulders carried the weight of someone used to doing things himself, someone who didn't expect anyone to make things easier. At his side, holding his hand tightly, was a boy with bright, restless eyes and a mop of light brown hair that refused to stay combed. Mason, 6 years old, quick to notice everything and quicker to ask about it, looked around the glittering ballroom as if he'd stepped into another planet. His gaze darted from the chandeliers to the floral centerpieces to the line of waiters in crisp uniforms. They weren't supposed to be here. Not really. A friend of a friend had won a raffle ticket for the gala, a novelty prize at a charity auction, and passed it to Daniel with a laugh. Go have a fancy night, man. See how the other half lives. Daniel had nearly turned it down, but Mason's excitement had convinced him. Still, the moment they crossed the threshold, he knew this wasn't their scene. The room smelled faintly of money, subtle colognes, champagne, food too delicate to fill anyone's stomach. Across the crowd, suits gleamed under the warm light. Sequin dresses caught the glow like tiny mirrors, and every smile seemed practiced. Daniel had been out of work for weeks, patching together side jobs, changing alternators, fixing lawnmowers, even hauling junk to keep the rent paid and food in the fridge. He didn't have the luxury of evenings spent sipping champagne and talking about quarterly returns. 5 minutes in, he was already thinking about finding the exit. He could tell Mason was starting to feel the same. His son's hand tightened in his like it always did when he felt out of place. Daniel crouched slightly to whisper, "We'll stay a bit, grab some of those little sandwiches, then head home, all right?" But Mason's attention had snagged on something. His gaze had shifted away from the sparkle and the bustle, settling instead on the quiet corner near the wall. A girl about his age sat there, cane resting against her leg, a golden retriever curled at her feet. Her posture was still, her head angled slightly down as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. "Dad," Mason murmured, tugging at his sleeve. "Why is that girl so quiet?" Daniel followed his son's gaze. For reasons he couldn't explain, the sight stopped him cold. He didn't know the girl, didn't know her story, but something in the way she sat, separate, untouched by the swirl of the room, stirred something familiar. The weight of silence, the ache of isolation. He'd felt it himself, years ago, after Mason's mother had left without warning. He remembered the way the world had seemed to move on without him, the way people's voices had become background noise he couldn't quite touch. And just like that, the thought of leaving vanished. Without another word, Daniel began to walk toward her. Daniel slowed his steps as he neared the far wall, mindful not to let his boots thump too loudly against the polished floor. The girl didn't turn her head, but he noticed a subtle shift. Her fingers paused mid-stroke on the golden retriever's fur, the slightest tensing in her shoulders. The dog, sensing him, lifted its head and gave a polite, quiet sniff, tail thumping once before settling again. Mason walked beside him, still clutching his juice box from the refreshment table. The thin cardboard crinkled in his grip, the tiny straw bobbing with each step. He glanced at his father, unsure, but Daniel gave him a small nod that said it's okay. When they reached her, Daniel crouched down so his voice would meet her at the right level. "Hey," he said softly, careful to keep his tone even, gentle, but not pitying. "Mind if I sit with you?" Ava, though he didn't yet know her name, turned her head slightly toward him, her face angled in that particular way that told him she was listening. She didn't speak. She didn't nod. But she didn't turn away either. That was enough. He lowered himself onto the chair beside her, moving slowly so the legs wouldn't scrape against the floor. Mason plopped down on his other side without the same caution, and the sudden motion jostled his juice box. It slipped from his hand and hit the hardwood with a wet splat, the sticky liquid pooling instantly. Ava startled. Her shoulders jumped, her cane shifted, and her free hand twitched toward her lap. "Oops. Sorry," Mason blurted, looking from the spill to her, his cheeks flushing. He gave a small giggle, more from nerves than amusement. Silence returned, wrapping around them like a fragile shell. Daniel let it sit. He didn't rush to fill it, didn't try to coax her with forced cheer. He simply sat there, elbows on his knees, keeping his movements slow enough for her to register. When her fingers returned to stroking the retriever's fur, he leaned in just slightly, his voice barely above the music drifting from the stage. "You don't have to talk," he murmured. "But if you wanna, I'm listening. And I won't leave." He meant it. Not as some clever line, not as a trick to get her to open up. Just a truth. The girl didn't answer. Daniel didn't expect her to. He was here to stay, even if all they did was share the same quiet. Around them, the gala kept spinning. Laughter, clinking glasses, speeches in the distance. But in this small pocket of the room, everything felt still. Minutes passed in that quiet corner, measured not by the ticking of a clock, but by the soft, steady breaths of the golden retriever and the faint hum of the gala in the distance. Daniel didn't fidget. He didn't look at his phone or scan the crowd. His attention rested fully on the girl beside him, the way you might watch the sky before a storm, not in fear, but in readiness. Mason, having recovered from his juicebox disaster, busied himself with quietly naming things he could see. The chandelier above, the way the flowers looked like fireworks, the bow tie on the man across the room that looked like it was choking him. His voice was light, unforced, a child's running commentary on the world. Ava didn't speak, but Daniel noticed how her head tilted slightly when Mason talked, the faintest sign she was listening. Daniel stayed still, his earlier words hanging in the space between them. You don't have to talk, but if you want to, I'm listening. He hadn't said them to spark a miracle. He knew better than to expect one, but he meant them with a sincerity that didn't demand anything in return. And then, without warning, something shifted. A small hand reached out, tentative at first, brushing against the fabric of his sleeve. Daniel froze, not out of discomfort, but so she could set the pace. Her fingers moved upward, lightly grazing the rough seam of his flannel, then curving toward his face. She touched his cheek, tracing along his jawline, pausing when her fingertips met the coarse texture there. You have a beard, she said. The words were quiet, almost fragile, as if they had to pass through a locked gate before finding the air. But they were words. Words no one had heard from her in 2 years. Daniel blinked. Mason's eyes went wide, his mouth forming a small O of surprise. Across the ballroom, Gregory Lane had just turned from a conversation with a city official when he heard his daughter's voice. For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it, a cruel trick of his mind replaying something from before the funeral. But then he saw her, leaning slightly toward a man he didn't know, her hand on his cheek, her lips moving. The CEO's polished composure cracked, disbelief and raw emotion surging at once. He started toward them, weaving through the crowd like a man crossing an ocean on foot. You have a beard. The sentence seemed to linger in the air, suspended between them, delicate as a glass ornament. Daniel's breath caught, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they meant. For 2 years, this little girl had lived behind a wall of silence that no one had been able to breach. And now, here they were, in a noisy ballroom full of strangers, with her voice slipping out like it had been waiting for the right moment, the right person. Ava's hand lingered on his cheek a moment longer, fingertips moving as if memorizing the shape of him. Then, her head turned slightly, not toward the crowd, not toward her father moving through it, but toward Mason. What's your name? She asked. Mason blinked in surprise, almost missing his cue. I'm Mason, he said quickly, sitting up straighter. A grin spread across his face, proud and relieved all at once. And that's my dad. He fixes cars, and he makes the best grilled cheese in the world. The corners of Ava's mouth curled upward, slowly, like muscles rediscovering an old pattern. It wasn't just a smile. It was the kind that reached her eyes, even if those eyes didn't see the world the way others did. Really? She asked. Really? Mason said, nodding hard enough to make his hair bounce. He puts 2 different kinds of cheese on it. And sometimes bacon, if we've got it. A faint laugh escaped her, so soft it could have been mistaken for a sigh. But Daniel heard it. Mason heard it. And across the room, Gregory Lane, still making his way toward them, heard enough to quicken his pace. By the time he reached the edge of their small circle, his face was unguarded in a way few had ever seen. No corporate mask, no measured CEO expression, just a father on the edge of tears. Ava, sweetheart, he said, his voice unsteady. She turned toward the sound instantly, her hand lifting again, this time to touch his face. Her small palm rested against his cheek, mapping it as she had Daniel's. You're crying, she whispered. Gregory swallowed hard, his throat too tight for words. He nodded, the movement subtle under her touch. For a moment, the gala's music, the clinking glasses, the hum of conversation all faded into the background. In this quiet pocket of the world, a door had opened, one that had been locked for far too long. Gregory stood there for a second, letting his daughter's words wash over him. The sight of her hand on his face, her small, warm fingers tracing the line of his cheekbone, was almost too much. For 2 years, he had lived with the sound of silence where her voice should have been. He'd tried everything. The most sought-after pediatric therapists, specialists in childhood trauma, even experimental sensory programs. Nothing had broken through. And now, without fanfare or preparation, she had spoken, not just to him, but to a complete stranger and his little boy. Gregory's vision blurred as he fought to hold himself steady. Don't scare her, he reminded himself. The last thing he wanted was to turn this fragile moment into something overwhelming. Daniel, sensing the shift, rose quietly from his seat. His movement was slow, deliberate, giving father and daughter the space they needed. "We'll let you too," he began, his voice low, but Gregory lifted a hand to stop him. "Wait." Their eyes met for the first time. Gregory seeing a man who clearly didn't belong in this ballroom of high-gloss ambition, and Daniel seeing not a billionaire CEO, but a father whose composure had been stripped away by gratitude. "You," Gregory's voice faltered, then steadied. "You did in 5 minutes what the best doctors in the world couldn't do in 2 years." Daniel shrugged, as if to brush off the praise. "Sometimes people don't need fixing," he said quietly, "just understanding." The simplicity of the statement hit Gregory harder than he expected. He looked at Daniel and realized that this wasn't about luck or coincidence. There was something in the man's presence, his way of showing up without trying to control the outcome, that had given Ava a reason to step out of her silence. Ava, still holding her father's cheek, tilted her head. "Can Mason and I talk again later?" she asked. Gregory smiled through the tightness in his throat. "Of course," he said, "as much as you want." Daniel took a small step back, ready to fade into the crowd now that the moment seemed complete. But something in Gregory's chest resisted letting him walk away. There was a rare quality here, one he couldn't afford to let drift out the ballroom doors. Gregory took a breath, glancing briefly at his daughter before turning his full attention back to Daniel. The gala noise pressed in again. Clinking glasses, polite laughter, the low hum of business talk. But for Gregory, it all faded behind the urgency of this moment. "Don't go," he said simply. Daniel paused, his expression open but cautious. "It's your night. I don't want to get in the way." "You're not in the way," Gregory replied, shaking his head. "You're the reason tonight means anything." He stepped closer, his voice dropping so it wouldn't carry beyond their small circle. "You've done something no one else could. You've reached her." Daniel's instinct was to shrug it off again, but there was a steadiness in Gregory's eyes that told him this wasn't casual gratitude. It was the kind that came with a decision already forming. "Come work for me," Gregory said. Daniel blinked. "I fix cars, not code." Gregory's mouth quirked in a faint smile. "You understand people. That's rarer." Daniel hesitated, weighing the words. He'd been out of steady work for weeks, juggling odd jobs and side gigs, and the bills didn't care how many hours he'd put in under the hood of a car. Still, walking into a corporate world like this felt like stepping onto another planet. "Look," Gregory continued, "I don't know exactly where you'd fit yet, but I can find a place for someone who knows how to make people feel seen." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Only if the job comes with grilled cheese on Thursdays." For the first time in a long while, Gregory laughed. A real laugh, not the polite one he reserved for business dinners. "Deal." Behind them, Mason and Ava had already started their own small conversation. Simple questions and answers, the kind of easy back and forth that adults often overlook but children value like treasure. The sound of it made Gregory certain he wasn't acting on impulse. This wasn't charity. It was an investment of the rarest kind. Weeks later, the gala felt like a lifetime ago. The glitter of chandeliers and the press of high society small talk had been replaced by the warm scent of grilled cheese drifting through Daniel's modest kitchen. The house wasn't big, just 2 bedrooms, a narrow living room, and a porch that creaked when you stepped on the far left board, but it had a way of feeling lived in. The kind of place where people stayed because they wanted to, not because they had to. On the porch, Ava sat cross-legged beside Mason. A late afternoon breeze stirred the ends of her dark curls as she leaned forward, her cane resting across her lap. The golden retriever sprawled at her feet, one paw stretched out toward Mason as if claiming him, too. They weren't talking the whole time. There were still long stretches where Ava simply listened, but when she did speak, her words carried a different quality now. They had weight, intention, even humor. "What's it like to ride your bike down a hill?" she asked, tilting her head toward Mason. "It's like your stomach forgets where it's supposed to be," Mason replied, making her laugh, a sound that came more easily these days. Inside, Gregory stood by the kitchen counter, slicing tomatoes for a side salad while Daniel worked at the stove, flipping sandwiches in a cast-iron skillet. The two men didn't talk about the exact shape of their arrangement, whether Daniel's role was part mentorship, part outreach, or something else entirely, but they both knew it was working. Gregory had started stopping by a couple of times a week, sometimes with his laptop and stacks of papers, sometimes with nothing more than a bag of groceries and an appetite. And each time, he made a point of listening, not just to Ava, but to Mason, to Daniel, to the small rhythms of the house. It was still a long road. Ava's silence hadn't vanished completely. Some days she spoke only a word or two, but the words she chose mattered, and they came from a place of trust. From the porch, her voice drifted in again, soft but sure. "When's grilled cheese day?" Daniel looked up from the stove, smiling toward the open window. "Today, and every Thursday after." Gregory chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "I'm starting to think that was the best negotiation I've ever made." Sometimes, healing didn't require grand strategies or expensive interventions. Sometimes, it was as simple as one person sitting beside you, promising to stay, and keeping that promise.